look closely at the Joomla API as part of this, which was what Gary's original presentation was going to be about. Okay? So briefly, I want to introduce myself. And is this better if I stand in front of here? Does it make a difference? My name is Rafael Diaz-Tushman, and I'm the founder of Dioscuri Design. We're a Manhattan-based design company that specializes in Joomla. So we're here in New York on 123rd Street and do not only full-fledged websites for clients, but we also do support subscriptions for almost 20 Joomla extensions that we've built over the past 3 years, including Tienda, which I presented yesterday, which is an e-commerce app for Joomla. This presentation is one I wrote up for a presentation in Bangkok at the beginning of last month. Scott just had me fill in for Gary because his daughter is sick, so I apologize if this is not what you expected exactly. However, it'll be fun. This is a presentation on being more efficient during your Joomla development. I'm going to show you some of the tools that we use while developing plugins and some of the tips and tricks that I train my developers in for being able to rapidly develop extensions. I mean, we can churn out a new component with several different views and an admin side and a front end in about 4 hours. So, in a plugin we can do in about an hour. Module we can do in less than an hour. So, these are the sort of tips and tricks that I use for training my new developers, and hopefully you can benefit from them as well. So how many of you have already built a Joomla extension in the past, whether it's a module or a plugin?
Halfway.
Almost, yeah. And what were some of the complexities you bumped into when you were building it, and what kind of extension were you building? So did you build a module, a plugin, a component?
Well, the first extension I built was like it was just a component. Okay. And the user would log into the admin side and then add cities and locations, and then it would just create an XML file that would load into a Flash site. Okay. All right. So it was pretty much all admin stuff.
Okay. All right, that's good.
I'll show you about a component that would give you horizontal ACL. Okay. So in other words, the same data will appear, but depending on the user group, it would display the same data differently, so you don't have a whole bunch of if statements on it.
Gotcha.
And kind of decide to use another CMS.
Anybody else? Any development?
I remember I wrote to you for advice on file packaging.
That's
and,
right.
The XML.
Okay. Well, we've got I've got in here a slide about with some tips on how to work with packaging up the component before distributing it. So, and this is good. Big fat hairy disclaimer about what I'm about to tell you. There are several dozen ways to do any one thing, right? This is just how we do it, and it doesn't make it the best way, it doesn't make it the right way, it's just how we do it. We happen to be pretty competent at doing it this way, and it's very fast. We are a little bit different from the way that the Joomla.org's docs recommend you set up your local workstation, and that's fine. I mean, you can do it any number of different ways. So this is not perfect, it's just how we do it. When developing, we tend to use, most of us are on Windows machines or Ubuntu or on Linux machines. Some of us are on Macs. Either way, the working environment is typically the same. We all use Eclipse. A couple of our developers use Coda. They're on Macs. You may be interested in that. The important thing is just to have a fast and lightweight IDE that can load up if it crashes very quickly. That gives you syntax highlighting, access to SVN, and code completion. And that's one of the things I'll be showing you in here when we hook up to the Joomla API. You want to have code completion so you don't have to memorize all of the libraries within Joomla. Right? It'll just finish things out for you. The second thing is setting up a local host on your computer. On a Windows station, just use XAMPP, it's fastest. You can use the same program on a Mac. And then if you are in a Linux distribution, just set up the LAMP stack automatically. Right? Just install Apache, MySQL, and PHP from the command line. If you're working in a Linux distro, you should be able to work in the command line anyway. Okay? And you don't have to worry about writing down all this. I'll give the slides to Scott, and they'll be up on the website later. So we're going to move through these slides pretty quickly. This is about setting up your local PHP configuration, setting up your local host Joomla configuration, a quick overview on version control, and then how to automate some of those repetitive tasks that you go through when you're developing a plugin, and then configuring your IDE. I may jump to the IDE configuration first because that's where I'll introduce you to the Joomla API and how to set up the code completion. So, if you are working in Eclipse, let me close everything here. One of the first things you'll want to do is create a project that is associated with a particular library within Joomla. And the reason you'll want to do this is because you're going to add it as part of the PHP include path for every single one of your projects later. And that enables the code completion on all of your projects. I'll show you what I mean. Let's say we have a checkout of the Joomla SVN. Oh, I have it closed. Let's say, oh, that's too bad. I don't want to open it up. It takes too long. They're all closed. That's too bad. Okay, so instead of using the Joomla SVN itself as an example, let's say you have your own new extension that you're developing, and you have a checkout of the SVN inside Eclipse. When you set up the project, you have the option of modifying the PHP include path here, right? And the idea behind creating a project for the Joomla 1.5 library is this. While you're editing the files, if you are using a Joomla library class, the Eclipse will automatically complete the whatever you're typing in, right? And you can quickly jump into the file. Right? Let's say we want to do jfactory get user. By holding down Control and clicking on the get user, you can, one, get the actual code, or if you click on it, it'll jump you to the file within the Joomla library and show you the actual code for that particular function. So the way you would add the Joomla 1.5 library as a project within Eclipse, you go like this. You'll create the new project. Call it whatever you want. And you're going to create it from an existing location on your local host. If you've installed, and you probably already have, a local host version of Joomla on your computer, then you just browse to the folder within your local host. So I'm using XAMPP here. I'm going to open up the htdocs folder, go to a Joomla installation, and I'm just going to choose the libraries Joomla folder. The reason I'm not adding the entire Joomla 1.5 installation as a new project within Eclipse is that it won't validate. Eclipse performs an automatic validation on the HTML and the entire project every time you open up Eclipse. And so having it go through what in my case now is maybe a 30 or 40 megabyte installation of Joomla, having it do that every time you open up Eclipse is just memory intensive, resource intensive, and it slows down your entire IDE. So I wouldn't recommend that. You just add the Joomla folder itself underneath libraries. Oh, that's too bad. So, and I've already done that, and that's what this Joomla 1.5 library project is. So I'm not going to finish this, but what it ends up doing is creating a project that looks like this. And it's just a reference to the libraries folder within your localhost Joomla installation. And so we can actually browse through the important part of the Joomla API inside this project here. This is what Joomla is. Joomla's a framework on which you can build different applications that perform whatever you want, right? An e-commerce, blog, whatever you want. The overwhelming majority of the unique parts of Joomla are inside this folder here. So if you open up a typical module that you just download off the JED, it's going to be making references to classes inside these files here. So now, every time we create a new project, every time we check out, say, a public SVN for a component, a popular component, when I do it, I will always add a reference, not always, because clearly I haven't done it here, to this Joomla 1.5 library project that we just created. And so I'll show you what, now that I found one that I don't have it on, so clearly I haven't set up the reference to the Joomla 1.5 library folder. Let's go in here, and instead of, as we did in billets, where we were able to type in jfactory get user, let's open up the one in Juga, a file in Juga, and do the same thing. You see, it's not doing the code completion. And if I were to actually finish typing it myself, jfactory get user, I can't hover over it, I can't click on control, and I don't get the benefit of having the associated library folder. The minute I make that association on the base project folder, and this is under PHP include path, the projects tab, add the associated project. The minute I do it, well now, if I hold down control, we have the auto completion. Okay? Now the Joomla API, you might not know exactly where to go to find, for example, this particular function. One of the first things I tell our new developers to do is to create a bookmark at these two sites. One is a public PHP cross-referencing site handled by, I think it's a German company?
Yeah.
Yeah, joomlademo.de. I don't have this in my slides, so you might want to actually write this down. This is a searchable version of Joomla, and you can see which one they have installed. It's Joomla 1.5.22. Here's the URL. I'll add this to the slide before I give it to Scott, so you don't have to write it down actually. This is a searchable version. You hover over this search link on the top right, and you can find any class within Joomla, not only where it's used, like for instance, let's try jfactory. Am I typing that right? jfactory. It'll tell you not only where it's used, it's referenced 977 times within Joomla, but it'll tell you where it's defined. That's incredibly useful. If you didn't have the library within your Eclipse installation set up, you could find where jfactory is defined here very, very quickly.
Does it tell you what it does?
You can click and actually browse the code. It's going to tell you only what's inside the comment blocks from the core developers of Joomla. So it's not human intelligent. It can't tell you what it does unless the comment blocks are in there.
Right, but you click on it and just read the script, that's all.
If you click on this factory.php file here, yeah, it'll take you to the script file.
Right, that's where you read the comments.
That's where you read the comments, right. It has two views once you're viewing the actual file. It'll give you a brief overview of each of the functions inside that particular class file, as well as the comments that the core developers left in there. But it'll also give you the actual source view. So this is just an alternative to the creating the library file project inside Eclipse, and it's a little bit easier to browse through because you can actually search and find not only the original source code for the class, but also all uses of it. So if you need to see sample code where other people have used jfactory in other components, you can find it very quickly. Yeah.
Is 1.6 going to be that much different in terms of libraries?
Huh?
Are they deprecating some or?
Not the Joomla folder itself. It's not terribly different. They've kept most of the base classes. what they have done is they've pruned this entire folder, the included libraries here. So Joomla itself is now lighter because it's not including all of these different libraries.
Well, the PHP, you don't need the PHP 4s anymore.
Yeah, you don't need backwards compatibility at all. So about, I think the Joomla 1.6 libraries folder is about half the size of this. But the Joomla libraries itself, you know, some of them change a little bit, and then there are some new ones like JForm, JDatabase Query, jQuery. But for the most part, this remains the same. There's also a couple ACL classes that they've added. So this is a useful URL. The second API reference for Joomla, and it's api.joomla.org. Everyone to come here because it's a slightly more user-friendly version of the same folder. This, I don't know. Okay, so unfortunately it's not being maintained. Current version of Joomla is 1.5.22. So we're looking on the official api.joomla.org site, and it's still only referencing 1.5.15. And that's unfortunate. Yeah, it's about a little over a year old. That's too bad, because this is a pretty handy way for library folder. For example, let's go to the JFactory class, which will be here. And it gives you similar information as the PHP cross-reference URL that I showed you a second ago, in just a slightly more user-friendly way. Okay? You can jump around as well. Okay, so that's api.joomla.org, and then the PHP cross-ref handled by joomlademo.de. Now let's go back into Eclipse. And run over some of those tips and tricks. When you're developing, one of the most important things to do is turn on error reporting within your PHP installation. You really need it. I can't tell you how many times we've installed a Joomla extension and just suddenly had PHP notices showing up throughout the site as a result. So at the level of both PHP and within the Joomla configuration, enable error reporting. This is inside your php.ini file. You're going to search for the error underscore reporting value and set it to a very high level on your development environment. Okay, and that means either EAL, EAL or E-deprecated. That's the value we actually use in our development here. But you could also do this. I wouldn't recommend it yet for 1.5 development. The E underscore strict is going to show you every time you use static references to classes within Joomla, and it happens throughout. It's not a terrible way of coding. It's just not going to be used commonly in the future. So I wouldn't use the second level unless you are really writing on 1.6. Okay. There's another setting within your PHP ini file you'll want to change, and that's the display underscore errors value. Turn that on, because it'll show all of your errors while you're coding. And then after making those changes to your PHP ini file, you need to restart Apache, and the way you do that will vary depending on what your local host system is. Okay. The next thing to do is to go into your local host Joomla installation and also make sure that it's not at the runtime disabling error reporting. When you're on a live site, you're always going to want your error reporting off. So this is a pretty handy setting. I wouldn't recommend that Joomla ever take it out. But make sure you go into the Joomla global configuration and also enable both debug system and debug language, and image there. The debug system will output really handy information about the application that's running. Every page load will output at the bottom. If you have the debugging mode enabled, will output trying to optimize a component, for example, that you're writing, you'll very quickly see how much memory is being used, how many queries are being executed, and you could start to cache all of that, or just rewrite your code so that you're not duplicating queries. Let me show you what that looks like. So in the global configuration, the two settings are underneath the server tab. Underneath the system tab. Debug system I have set to yes, and I'll show you in a second what it looks like to debug the language. But when we set this to yes and enable the debugging plugin, there it is right there. Now you can see underneath every single page load all of this information about the application that just loaded. Is that off the screen? Oh. So you can see how much memory it used just to load that page, and all of the different queries Joomla had to run in order to load the page we're looking at. So it's really handy information.
Which page is that showing? What page is that showing for the page you just loaded down?
It's showing for this page, so the plugin manager with the filter applied of bug. Okay, so it's showing you information about every query that was necessary to load this page right here.
This page. So how would you see the front end page? You go to the front end page and it's shown the bottom? That's on the bottom, okay.
So it's also going to show at the bottom. That's one reason you don't want this enabled on your live site.
Of course,
Because then you'll get a lot of information.
What on there is bugs and what is there just normal?
Right now, this is all just normal. This is just a normal list of the queries that Joomla requires in order to load your front page. It's not really going to show you bugs within the debugging mode.
We'll show you what's actually broke. We'll show you what's actually breaking.
Why don't we break something, and then we'll show you what the debugging mode is doing. Okay. So, how about we're in 1.5.2.0, we'll go into Joomla. Okay. I'm going to break the admin side of Tienda. With a bad query. How about that? So this table doesn't exist. And this is another tip I'm going to show you later on in the presentation. So I've made a change here inside the Tienda SVN checkout. And normally when you're developing, normally when you're developing in the Joomla world, they tell you several different ways for testing your code out, what you should check out and what you should store inside an SVN. Our SVN repositories are always organized as just the component themselves. When we do live testing, like for example, when I want to test this out right now, we'll use an application called Ant, and you don't have to worry about it now because I'll show you again later. You could use Fing, which is another automating application. We just choose to use Ant, and I'm just going to copy all the files that I just changed within Tienda over to my local host, so I can immediately test out my work while preserving the changes that I've made within the SVN repository. So right now, if I wanted to, I could commit this up to the repository, and it would break it for everyone's Tienda installations. But for me, I can just test out my work before committing it here. So now let's jump over to Tienda on the admin side. Why didn't it break? Let me make sure I'm on the right one.
It is so well built.
Yeah. It's because I copied it to the wrong local host. debugging mode is going to reveal that I mistyped set query. So let me go fix that. The debugging mode is now revealing the entire stack, every file that was loaded up until the error was encountered in the application. If I had turned off, if we had turned off the debugging mode, here's what we would have seen. It just hides the error, okay? So by enabling the debugging mode, you're getting extremely useful output for what you need to change within your code. And let's go back and take a look at exactly what it was telling us. And let's refresh. It's telling us in what line it encountered the error. Okay, so it executes this code query on line 33 of tienda.php. It's telling you exactly where to go to fix that error, and you can see line 33 is this right here, where it's executing that query. So enable the debugging mode. Let's go fix it. Now it's gone. The other item within the Joomla configuration to enable is debug language. If you're building a component, module, or plugin that's going to be used by people throughout the world, you want to make sure that it's translatable. Joomla's debugging language mode will tell you what strings are not being translated within your component, or module, or plugin, within your extension. So you can see now that I've changed it from yes to no. Every single string being displayed on the page will have identifying marks telling you whether or not they've been translated by Joomla's JText class. So when it's been successfully translated, meaning it has, meaning that somewhere within some of those language files that have been loaded by Joomla, which are all of these, if it has a dot on either side, it means it's been successfully translated. If we run into a string with question marks around it, it means it's not been translated, so you can run into your language file for your component and define the constant for it. Okay, so it's telling you what to fix, exactly what to fix. And let's take a look how it looks inside a component. 10 minutes, wow, that's fast. So,
it was short change our time a bit. So.
Gotcha. So this is telling us all of these strings within Tienda need to have strings created for them, or language translation strings created for them. So those are the two debugging modes. Also, within the Joomla global configuration, you'll want to set its error reporting level to maximum only on your only on your local host. That's a similar setting here, underneath server, the error reporting level here. You'll do that because at the runtime level, Joomla, if on a live site, if you happen to have your PHP INI file configured incorrectly, it will start displaying messages, but at the runtime level, Joomla can disable all error reporting if you want, setting it to none. So on your local host, set it to maximum. Next. Version control. How many of you are familiar with or have used version control to some degree? Yeah. Okay. Well, let's run over it very, very quickly on a very high level. There are several different flavors. We use Subversion for the most part, mainly because we want our developers to be familiar with what's used by the Joomla core project, and they're using Subversion on Joomla code. Git is very popular and becoming more popular than Subversion. So just make yourself familiar with whichever one you want. We just use Subversion. What version control does is it keeps a track of all of the different changes to every single file in the file system that's being tracked by Subversion. It doesn't bloat your system because it's not tracking excuse me, it's not making full copies of every single file that's changed. It's tracking differences between each file that's changed. And it allows you to be more experimental with your coding because you're never at risk of losing your work. So it helps preserve your sanity. Use some kind of version control. Eclipse has some built-in limited version control as well. You could roll back your changes up to, I think, up to 50 files, up to 50 changes. So enable that if you're not using an actual Subversion repository yourself. Subversion itself is used by Joomla. It's a free application, very ubiquitous, free documentation online. There's a URL to an SVN book. Check it out if you aren't familiar with SVN already. This is we don't need that. Now, using Subversion within Eclipse. How many of you actually use Eclipse when you're developing? What are you using?
Planning.
You're planning to. You don't right now. You're using the shell.
I usually most times, since it's mostly me, I use the text editor in Dreamweaver.
Okay. All right.
And I just and I version control my own numbering system.
Okay. And what other systems are being used? What are you using? You use Dreamweaver?
NetBeans.
What do you use? NetBeans is fine.
But I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's easy. Using Subversion within Eclipse is terrific. Let me show you what it's like. You'll need to install a plugin for Eclipse called Subclipse. Subclipse.org has all the instructions you need for installing it. It takes a couple steps. It's just typing in the name, or excuse me, typing in the URL for it to automatically download the files to install Subclipse. When you're in Eclipse and you have the Subclipse plugin, it's going to be able to identify for you all the changed files, all the files that you've changed within the checkout. So you can see this little yellow icon here on that folder means that this is an SVN repository folder. This little asterisk, called a dirty mark, is telling us that there's some file underneath this folder that has been changed and has not been committed up to the SVN repository for everyone else to have access to. So nobody else has access to the changes I've made to this payment plugin here. And you can follow the entire route all the way down to the specific files that were also changed. The neat part is, if I were to go ahead and start committing this entire folder's worth of files, with SVN, I can look at a diff directly in Eclipse of all the changes that I've made to the file before committing it. So you see it highlighting here online, for example, 1 at 163. It's showing me what I've actually changed. This is what it used to be, and this is what it will be. And this is what it will be after I make the commit. And it's telling you exactly what changed on the line as well. Not the entire line changed, just this string right here. And you can do that for every single file. It's very, very handy. Now, you can also, like I mentioned earlier, it preserves your sanity by allowing you to roll back to previous revisions. From right here, I could at any point replace my entire checkout of the SVN for Tienda with a previous version here. I could switch to another branch, or I could switch to another revision just by selecting from the repository history here. So you're never at risk. You could always roll back at any point to a previous version of the code. And now, let's jump over here while it's doing that. There we go.
Raphael,
Yeah.
if you make some changes to a file and I'm working on your team, before I go up to sync and get the latest, I can see the differences between what's on my local computer and what you've updated the same way, and
Yes.
Windows side by side.
Yes. So say, and this is a typical situation, especially with projects that have, several dozen people working on it at once. For example, like right now in the past day, we've had 4 different people committing up to Tienda. If you have 2 people working on the same file at once, it's going to be whoever gets their commit up first. That will become the repository's default. The next time you attempt to make a commit using that file, if you haven't performed an update in which you pull down the most recent version of the repository into your project, you should. It's good practice to do an SVN update before committing. If you haven't, Eclipse will tell you what, it'll tell you what files are in conflict. And you can go through a pretty simple process where you resolve those conflicts. I think it would be hard for me to recreate a conflict
No, we don't need to.
right now. You don't need to see that. But it takes you through and it'll say, all right, this block of code here is in conflict with the most up-to-date version on the
So
repository.
one of the ways around that is to make sure that you're working on it, you check out. In some version, you can check out a file that's on the repository so someone else doesn't try and change that while you're changing that.
Locking it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do that. We don't do that too often. We try to have everybody resolve the conflicts before committing. In fact, I don't know if we've ever had to use that.
But do you often have two people working the same script at the same time?
We do. Yeah. Like we'll have people working on base models for Tienda at the same time.
Because then they have to decide what's better in the code.
The developers do.
Yeah, and they say, oh, well, I'll do it this way.
Yeah, we wouldn't want everybody not to be able to work on the same files at once. This is the history of the commits to the Tienda project. So at the time I was going to revert to a particular revision. You can choose from this long list. I think up to 25 are being shown here to just revert your entire checkout to. All right, let's get out of here. When you set up your SVN repository, our recommendation is to set it up as if it's going to be an installable package. For us, creating an installable package from the Tienda repository is a one-click process. A lot of people, when developing for Joomla, will put an entire Joomla installation on their SVN and do the editing directly in there. There's an advantage to that. You can set up Xdebug for the entire SVN repository. It just, in my opinion, is not useful. You end up getting the large 25 megabyte SVN repository, and every time you check it out or do an update, every time you check out a new branch, you end up downloading 25 megabytes plus. If you just have the package files itself on the repository, you'll work much quicker. And I'll show you one of the solutions we have for testing your code, and that is using Ant. How many of you are familiar with Ant or Fing, which are used for automating a lot of tasks, generally in Java development, but not Fing, but are you familiar with it at all? Well, let me show you really quickly how we use Ant and what it actually allows you to do. So like I said in the previous slide, we only have the project's files itself on the SVN repository. The limitation for that is you can't just make your entire checkout of the SVN repository into a localhost running version of Joomla, which is what they will recommend on the Joomla's documentation. However, even though we've only got a checkout of each project, like for example, I have a checkout of every one of our projects here, billets through Tienda. And you can see that the file system is actually just an installable package, including the admin files, all plugins, modules, and the front-end files, and the installation file here. There are two files at the bottom that are not part of the installation package. One is a build file, and one is a config file. What this allows us to do, let me make sure I'm working on the right one, is we can tell Ant where we want to place all of these files from the package, as if they were going into an actual localhost. They are going into an actual localhost. So this is the full path to my localhost installation of Joomla, Joomla-1520. And our build file is what Ant runs through and actually executes every time I tell it to update my localhost. And what it does is it copies the files from the location here, all the changed files rather, all the changed files from the SVN repository here, it copies them to their appropriate locations within my localhost. So So I could use one single localhost, Joomla-1520, for testing all of my projects. So let me show you exactly what happens when we change a particular file. So I'm going to go into the dashboard view and edit one file and just say, all right, so now SVN has tracked that I've changed this file. And if I want to test out my code changes, I'll go to the billets build file and tell it to update my localhost for those changed files. It copies them over. And now when I refresh the dashboard, am I in the right place? Yeah. I can immediately see what my code has done. Okay, and that allows me to have checkouts of each and every project and use one localhost installation to do all that testing. And I can immediately undo this change and test it out again. Yep.
How do you guys go about managing changes that you do to MySQL?
For the install.c.
Yeah, like for like when you're doing table structures and that kind of stuff.
We have a couple different ways for doing that. Each installation package has the install.sql file in it, so every time you make a change to it, inside admin install.sql, every time you make a change to it, this will be treated like any other PHP file, and when you commit it, people will be able, the other developers will be able to see what files, or excuse me, what fields you added to this to the file. We just have an internal policy where we have one ticket on our project managing site that's called DB schema changes, so database schema changes. Everyone follows that ticket. Every time you make a commit to the repository that involves a change to the database, you reference that ticket, everyone gets notified. And so every developer is then responsible for either reinstalling or just manually making the change to their database tables. I think I did the SVN update, yeah. So now that the changes are gone. And this works not just for the entire component, you can use Ant to update plugins as well. So even though this is a plugin and it's stored in a completely different folder on your Joomla installation, Ant already knows where it's supposed to copy those files to. All right. Ant can also be used, and that's one way to use Ant. We also use Ant for building the installable packages. Let me take you down to the Tienda build file and show you what it can do. We have these auxiliary extensions here. Those are used for a small subset of the users, and therefore these plugins aren't part of the main package of Tienda. One of the things we've done inside our build file is we've created this build packages command. So when we're ready to release Tienda, for us to build an installable package from the repository, all we have to do is double-click this build packages command. And it runs through and creates an installable package for every single separate folder in the entire repository and stores them in here. This packages folder, which you can see right here, is not on the SVN repository. It's created an installable package for the entire component, packages for all of the language files, packages for all the modules, and packages for all of the plugins. So we could distribute, right now I can distribute a nightly build of Tienda just using build packages here. And we can further automate this by just having our server do it and use the same script. But honestly, we're just using it locally. Okay. If any of you were doing development a couple of years ago and building out installation packages for your components, it was a tedious, time-consuming thing where you were listing every single file inside the XML file for the component. We also had you don't have to do that anymore because now they have a different command inside the XML file for installing an entire folder's worth of files. but we also had a command previously that would loop through every single file in the package and create the code for listing all the files inside the XML file. It's no longer necessary. Either way, you can use Ant to automate a lot of those repeated tasks that you go through when you're developing. Any questions about Ant? All of that I just showed you is on our public repository, and we also have wiki on all of it on projects.dioscuri.org. Where is it? Under our general info, we have all of this information that I'm giving you inside a wiki. So you could set up your workstation how we do it, and it'll walk you through it step by step. And this is free. I mean, you can browse this without even registering on projects.dioscuri.org. And some of them have pictures, I think. Anyway. I just did that. One other thing within Eclipse that you can do to really save some time is setting up keyboard shortcuts. We do certain things several dozen times a day, including an SVN update, an SVN commit, and you can actually set up keyboard shortcuts to your Ant commands, but I just use the mouse for that. Let me show you where that is done. Under Window Preferences, filter by keys, and you can set up a keyboard shortcut for any command within Eclipse. So, for example, even ones that are only created when you install a plugin for Eclipse, such as subclips. So, let's take a look at the commit command. You can bind it to any keyboard shortcut you want. Also the update. Okay, and that's under Window Preferences, filter by keys. You also will end up creating in your checkout of the SVN several hidden files that are specific to just you. This includes your Ant config file. That one's going to be unique to your installation of Joomla. Not everybody uses Windows, so they're not going to have a C prompt. So this Ant config file is unique to you. You may also create packages using your build file. You don't want to commit all of these zip files up to the repository because you'll end up getting that bloat that not everybody needs. So you can tell Eclipse which folders and which files to ignore from your local host. And that's a matter of going to Window, Preferences, Ignored Resources. And what we've done is we've got several different patterns that we just tell Eclipse never to commit up to the SVN. This includes Ant config, a hidden .svn folder, your .project folder, which is unique to your Eclipse checkout of that project, and I think that's all of them. No, I'm sorry, .build path. This is something that Ant uses for copying over the files. So remember to set up your ignored resources. Oh, and one more quick tip is using the outline tab in Eclipse. It's one of the reasons I prefer not doing development from the command line is inside the outline tab in Eclipse, you'll get a summary of the current file you're looking at. And you can quickly jump from function to function within a class file. So if you, for example, open up a large single file that has several different functions in it, let's just pick one. You can jump from function to function here using the outline tab. And it'll quickly tell you what the arguments for that function are as well. One other useful tool or feature within Eclipse is it tells you, for example, if we look at the tables here, all of our tables extend other existing classes. So just like with the Joomla library, you can hold down Control and click on all of these and jump to the function that, or excuse me, to the class definition that you're extending. But let's say you're also overriding an existing method inside one of those other classes. This little caret here is telling you what you're actually overriding. This little caret, you can also see it in the Outline tab. If you hold down on Control and click on that guy, it also takes you directly to the function that you're overriding. Let's see if we were looking at store. Same thing down here. It takes you to the function you're immediately overriding, and then this one itself is overriding one within the core Joomla JTable, so you can jump up as well. That's one of the advantages of using an IDE as opposed to the command line, or just Notepad. All right, so that's all I have. You guys have any questions for me? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And here's that URL in case you want to see the wiki.